The world, Izuku Midoriya had long ago realized, was inherently unfair. It was a cruel, empirical truth handed down to him at the tender age of 4 by a bald, apathy-driven doctor with an X-ray of a foot joint. Not all men are created equal. It was the fundamental doctrine of the modern, superhuman society. 80% of the global population possessed a genetic anomaly, a biological superpower known as a quirk. The remaining 20% were left behind in the evolutionary dust, relics of a bygone era. Izuku was one of the relics. He was quirkless, but society's rejection had never extinguished the burning, blinding flame in his chest. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to save people with a fearless smile, just like his idol, the symbol of peace, All Might. He had filled 13 notebooks with meticulous observations on hero strategies, quirk mechanics, and combat analysis. He studied, he analyzed, he prayed, hoping that perhaps sheer willpower could bridge the canyon between a normal human and a god. That delusion died on a sun-baked rooftop, struck down by the very god he worshipped. "It's not bad to dream," All Might had said, his voice stripped of its booming, theatrical bravado. The colossal, muscular hero had deflated in a plume of steam, revealing a skeletal, blood-spitting man broken by past battles. "But you also have to consider what's realistic. Can you be a hero without a quirk? No. I don't think you can. If you want to save people, become a police officer. It's noble work." The metal door to the rooftop stairwell clicked shut, the sound ringing with a deafening finality. All Might was gone. Izuku stood frozen. The wind whipped across the roof, biting into his school uniform, but he couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except a suffocating, crushing weight pressing down on his chest. His knees buckled, colliding hard with the concrete. He didn't cry. He was too hollowed out for tears. The 13th Hero Analysis Notebook, singed and waterlogged from his earlier encounter with Katsuki Bakugo, slipped from his trembling fingers. "No. I don't think you can." The words echoed in his skull, bouncing around like shrapnel. All Might, the man who had inspired his every waking moment, had looked him in the eye and delivered the executioner's blow. It wasn't done out of malice, but out of pity. And somehow, that made it infinitely worse. Izuku slowly picked himself up, his eyes dead and unseeing. He mechanically picked up his scorched notebook, the yellow cover mocking him. He walked down the stairs, out of the building, and into the sprawling streets of Muzurifu. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked. He needed to get away from the sounds of the city, the flashing billboards of grinning heroes, the distant sirens that once filled him with excitement. It all felt like a sick, elaborate joke played at his expense. His aimless wandering carried him far from the commercial districts, past the residential sprawl, and toward the densely wooded hills that bordered the city. The concrete gave way to dirt paths, and the roar of traffic faded into the rustling of leaves and the chirping of cicadas. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, fractured shadows through the canopy. Izuku walked until his lungs burned and his legs ached. He pushed through thick underbrush, uncaring as thorns tore at his black uniform trousers and scratched his skin. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the earth to open up and swallow the useless, quirkless Deku. As he stumbled through a particularly dense thicket, the ground beneath his feet suddenly gave way. With a yelp, Izuku tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling over roots and rocks until he crashed into a patch of soft moss. He lay there for a moment, groaning, staring up at the darkening sky visible through the trees. Even the forest seemed to be rejecting him. He pushed himself up, brushing the dirt off his clothes. He looked around to get his bearings and froze. Hidden in a natural depression in the hillside, completely enveloped by decades of overgrowth, stood a structure. It was an old, traditional Japanese dojo. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof tiles blanketed in thick green moss. The sliding doors were broken and rotted, vines creeping up the support pillars like skeletal fingers. It looked as though it hadn't been touched by human hands in over a century. Drawn by a strange, inexplicable pull, Izuku cautiously approached the ruined building. The wooden veranda groaned menacingly under his weight as he stepped up to the open threshold. He peered inside. The interior was massive, with polished wooden floors obscured by layers of dust, dead leaves, and debris. At the far end of the hall sat a raised dais, behind which hung a tattered, faded banner bearing a single, bold kanji, flow. Hello? Izuku called out, his voice barely a whisper. The only answer was the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. He stepped inside. The air was heavy, smelling of damp earth and old wood. Despite the ruin, there was an unmistakable aura to the place, a lingering sense of intense, unyielding discipline. Izuku walked toward the dais, his sneakers leaving footprints in the thick dust. As he approached the center of the room, his foot snagged on something. He stumbled, looking down. One of the floorboards was slightly elevated, the wood warped and dislodged. Curiosity, a trait deeply ingrained in the young analyst, momentarily overpowered his crushing depression. Izuku knelt down, wedging his fingers into the gap between the boards. He pulled. With a loud crack, the rotted wood splintered and gave way, revealing a dark, square hollow beneath the floor. It was a hidden compartment. Inside, resting on a bed of decaying silk, was an elongated wooden box, surprisingly well preserved. Izuku reached in and carefully lifted the box. It was heavy, made of dark mahogany, bound by rusted iron clasps. He snapped the brittle clasps open and lifted the lid. Inside lay 3 large, heavy scrolls of parchment, bound with faded blue ribbons. He took the first scroll, his heart beating a little faster. He unrolled it carefully, afraid the ancient paper might disintegrate in his hands. The parchment was covered in elegant, sweeping calligraphy, interspersed with highly detailed anatomical drawings of the human body, tracing lines of muscle, bone, and strange pathways of force. Izuku's eyes scanned the text. To whoever finds this, know that you hold the legacy of the water stream rock-smashing fist, Ryuji Gansaiken. Izuku frowned. He had never heard of a hero with that name, nor a quirk that sounded like that. He read on. This is not a meta-ability. This is not a quirk. This is the absolute zenith of human martial arts. In an era where humanity relies on genetic mutations to fight their battles, the art of the body has been forgotten. True power does not come from a genetic lottery. True power comes from discipline, flow, and the absolute mastery of one's own physical form. The water stream rock-smashing fist is the ultimate defensive and offensive art. It teaches one to move like a calm river, fluid, evasive, and uncatchable, and to strike like a raging torrent, shattering rocks and turning the opponent's strength against them. Izuku's breath hitched. Not a quirk. The words seemed to glow on the page. He unrolled the scroll further. The diagrams were impossibly complex. They detailed stances, breathing techniques, joint locks, and redirection methods. The writing spoke of striking with precision so absolute it could disrupt a man's nervous system, of deflecting blows with a frictionless palm, of turning an enemy's kinetic energy back into their own body. To master this art is to become an immovable rock in a roaring river. You must strip away your reliance on brute force. You must adapt. You must evolve. As Izuku stared at the diagrams, a strange sensation washed over him. He had always been a fast learner when it came to analyzing fighting styles. He had memorized every move of Kamui Woods, every stance of Endeavor, every punch of All Might. But looking at these diagrams felt different. It was as if the intricate lines of ink were burning themselves directly into his retinas, bypassing his conscious mind and searing themselves into his nervous system. For the first time all day, the crushing weight in his chest lightened. Here was a master, a man from a bygone era, who believed that a human, a normal, quirkless human, could achieve the absolute zenith of power through nothing but martial perfection. Boom! A massive, distant explosion shook the earth, rattling the wooden beams of the dojo. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Izuku jerked his head up, looking out the broken doors. Through the trees, in the direction of the city, a thick pillar of black smoke was rising into the twilight sky. A villain attack? Izuku's mind instantly went to the notebook at his side. Despite everything, despite All Might's rejection, despite the hopelessness, his legs moved on their own. The instinct to see, to learn, to help, was too deeply ingrained to be killed in a single afternoon. Without thinking, he shoved the first scroll into his yellow backpack, leaving the box and the other 2 scrolls safely hidden in the floorboards. He sprinted out of the dojo, scrambling back up the embankment and running through the woods toward the smoke. The Tatooine shopping district was a war zone. Fire licked at the sides of buildings, shattering glass and sending civilians screaming in terror. The acrid smell of burning plastic and shattered concrete choked the air. A massive crowd had gathered behind a police barricade, watching in horror as a nightmare unfolded in the center of the street. Izuku pushed his way through the throng of onlookers, panting heavily, his muscles screaming from the sprint. He reached the front line just behind the police tape. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. It was the sludge villain. The exact same monster made of toxic, liquid sewage that had nearly suffocated Izuku to death in a tunnel just hours earlier. All Might had captured him, put him in a plastic bottle. But the bottle must have fallen when Izuku grabbed onto All Might's leg. This is my fault, Izuku thought, ice flooding his veins. I dropped him. I caused this. The sludge villain had grown massive, laughing maniacally as explosions ripped from within his gelatinous body. Several pro-heroes were on the scene. Death Arms was smashing his fists against the sludge, but his blows passed harmlessly through the liquid. Kamui Woods was attempting to grab the villain, but the rampant fires prevented him from using his wooden tendrils. Empty Lady was too big to navigate the narrow street. They were all standing there. Just standing there, watching. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, coughing on the smoke. None of our quirks can grasp fluid. We have to wait for someone with a suitable quirk. Wait. Izuku thought, his hands gripping the police barricade. Wait for what? The person trapped inside is dying. Then, the smoke shifted. Izuku saw the hostage trapped within the swirling vortex of living sewage. Spiky ash-blonde hair. Fierce, crimson eyes wide with frantic, animalistic panic. It was Katsuki Bakugo. Kaken. Bakugo was firing massive explosions from his palms, trying desperately to blast his way out, but it was only feeding the fires around them. The sludge was forcing its way down Bakugo's throat, suffocating him, drowning him from the inside out. Bakugo met Izuku's eyes through the smoke. For the first time in 10 years, Bakugo wasn't looking at him with anger, arrogance, or disgust. He was looking at him for help. Something inside Izuku snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. His brain didn't calculate the odds. His mind didn't weigh the danger. His legs just moved. He vaulted over the police barricade, his yellow backpack bouncing against his shoulders, and sprinted dead ahead into the inferno. Hey! Kid! Stop! Are you crazy? Death Arms roared. Izuku didn't hear him. The roaring of the flames faded away. The screams of the crowd were silenced. Everything around him plunged into an eerie, terrifying slow motion. What am I doing? His conscious mind screamed. I don't have a quirk. I can't do anything. I'm going to die. But as the sheer, unadulterated terror of imminent death washed over him, something deep within his genetic code, something that had laid dormant for 14 years, misdiagnosed by a lazy doctor looking at a toe joint, woke up. It started as a burning sensation at the base of his spine. A violent, electrical shock that shot up his nervous system, frying his pain receptors and flooding his brain with an impossible amount of adrenaline and endorphins. His quirk was not an emitter. It was not a transformation. It was a latent, passive mutation, reactive evolution. A quirk so dangerous it only triggered when the host's life was in absolute, immediate peril, forcing the body to instantly adapt to survive the trauma. The near asphyxiation in the tunnel earlier that day had primed it. The crushing emotional stress of All Might's rejection had lowered his psychological inhibitors. And now, charging into a fiery death trap against a monster that could easily rip him apart, the quirk fully detonated. Izuku's eyes, usually wide and anxious, suddenly narrowed. The irises shifted, the emerald green flashing with a predatory, piercing yellow luminescence. His perception of time shattered. The flying debris from Bakugo's explosions seemed to hang suspended in the air. He could see the individual droplets of toxic sludge flying toward his face. His body felt lighter, stronger, coiled like a spring drawn to its absolute limit. I need to fight, Izuku's mind demanded. I need a weapon. His hyper-accelerated brain, searching frantically for a solution, latched onto the most recent combat data it had acquired. Not the hero notebooks. Not All Might's punches. The scroll. The incredibly detailed anatomical diagrams of the water stream rock smashing fist flashed across his mind's eye in vivid, eidetic clarity. His quirk, desperate to ensure his survival, didn't just remember the diagrams. It commanded his musculature to perfectly mimic the biomechanics depicted on the ancient parchment. Izuku's body shifted. As he ran, his center of gravity dropped unnaturally low. His arms lifted, not in the panicked flailing of a civilian, but in a precise, flowing guard. His fingers curled slightly, relaxed but ready to strike, his breathing falling into a deep, rhythmic cadence that drew maximum oxygen into his blood. The sludge villain noticed him. "You again! The brat from the tunnel! Come to die!" A massive, viscous tentacle of sludge, thick as a tree trunk, whipped through the air, aimed directly at Izuku's head. It was moving fast enough to shatter a brick wall. "Deku! Get back!" Bakugo managed to choke out, his eyes wide. Izuku didn't flinch. As the tentacle closed the distance, Izuku stepped into the attack. His right arm moved. It didn't punch, it flowed. The back of his hand met the incoming sludge tentacle. He didn't try to block it with force. Instead, executing the theory of the scroll with terrifying, instinctual perfection, Izuku traced the outer edge of the attack, applying just enough tangential pressure to redirect the kinetic energy. With a motion smooth as silk, Izuku guided the massive tentacle past his face. The force of the villain's own strike spun Izuku around, generating immense rotational momentum. Using the villain's speed against him, Izuku completed the spin, his left hand whipping out in a blindingly fast, open palm strike. Bam! Izuku's palm struck the side of the sludge tentacle. The kinetic energy he had redirected was expelled all at once. The impact sounded like a cannon shot. The dense, liquid structure of the tentacle violently ruptured, exploding into a shower of harmless green droplets. The heroes gasped. Death arms froze. The crowd went dead silent. A quirkless boy had just parried a lethal attack with his bare hands. The sludge villain roared in pain and confusion, feeling the feedback of his severed limb. "What the hell? You little pest!" The villain unleashed 3 more tentacles, whipping them at Izuku in a frenzied barrage. Izuku's yellow eyes tracked the movements perfectly. His body moved on autopilot, dancing through the attacks like a leaf on the wind. "Flow like a river," the scroll's words echoed in his mind. He ducked under the first tentacle, his body bending backward at an impossible angle. He parried the second with his forearm, sliding it over his shoulder and sending it crashing into a nearby streetlight. The third tentacle swept low to take out his legs. Izuku leapt gracefully into the air, spinning over the attack. While midair, his quirk pushed his muscular output to a dangerous limit. He landed directly on the villain's main body, right below where Bakugo was trapped. Strike like a raging torrent, Izuku unleashed a flurry of strikes. His hands were a blur of motion, glowing with a faint, bluish-white trail of displaced air. He didn't just punch the liquid. He targeted the structural integrity of the sludge, striking with sharp, piercing fingertips and heavy, rebounding palm thrusts. He was vibrating his strikes, sending rippling shockwaves through the villain's fluid body. Thwack, 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 thwack. The strikes hit with the force of a jackhammer. The villain screamed, his liquid body unable to absorb the localized, piercing impacts. The sludge holding Bakugo began to violently destabilize, losing its cohesion. "Let him go!" Izuku roared, his voice deeper, laced with a feral intensity that sent a shiver down Bakugo's spine. Izuku plunged both of his hands directly into the churning sludge, burying them up to his elbows. He felt the cold, suffocating pressure of the villain. But he didn't pull. He dug his fingers in, twisting his arms in opposite directions, creating a violent, rotational vortex within the fluid. The water stream rock smashing fist was designed to crush boulders. A viscous fluid didn't stand a chance. With a guttural yell, Izuku ripped his arms apart. The sheer martial force, amplified by his quirk-induced adrenaline, tore a massive hole in the villain's structure. Bakugo tumbled out of the gap, gasping for air, covered in slime but alive. Izuku caught him by the collar of his uniform, hauling him backward, away from the monster. The villain, enraged and destabilized, reformed a towering wave of sludge above them. "I'll kill you! I'll kill you both!" he shrieked, preparing to drop his entire mass upon them and crush them into the pavement. Izuku stood in front of Bakugo. His body was screaming in agony. The sudden, forced evolution and the strain of perfectly executing a superhuman martial art had pushed his unconditioned muscles to the tearing point. Microfractures spiderwebbed across his arm bones. Blood trickled from his nose, but his stance did not break. He lowered his center of gravity again, raising his hands, ready to attempt to deflect the impossible mass. Suddenly, a massive figure dropped from the sky, landing in front of them with a cratering impact. "I really am pathetic," a booming voice declared. Izuku blinked. The golden glow faded from his eyes, returning to their normal emerald green. The adrenaline crashed, and a wave of exhausting pain hit him so hard he nearly collapsed. All Might stood before them, his massive back serving as an impenetrable shield. Blood leaked from the hero's mouth, but his muscles were bulging with unimaginable power. "I told you the traits to make a great champion," All Might yelled, pulling his right arm back as the villain's wave crashed down. "But I failed to live up to my own ideals. Pros are always risking their lives." All Might unleashed a punch. Detroit. Smash! The sheer air pressure generated by the strike hit the sludge villain like a solid wall of titanium. The villain was instantly blown apart, scattered into thousands of pieces across the street. The shockwave continued upward, clearing the smoke, putting out the fires, and punching a hole directly through the storm clouds above. Seconds later, it began to rain. All Might stood victorious, panting heavily. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers. Izuku collapsed to his knees, staring at his trembling hands. The skin on his knuckles was bruised and torn. His muscles twitched involuntarily. But he wasn't looking at the damage. He was looking at the undeniable proof of what he had just done. He hadn't shot fire. He hadn't lifted things with his mind. He hadn't used a quirk, or at least an obvious one. He had used a martial art. A technique from a dusty scroll. And with it, he had done what a dozen pro heroes couldn't. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and loud voices. The heroes quickly moved in, collecting the scattered pieces of the sludge villain. Paramedics checked on Bakugo, who was sitting wrapped in a shock blanket, staring at the ground in a daze. Izuku, on the other hand, was surrounded by death arms, Kamui Woods, and an angry local police officer. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Death Arms barked, pointing a thick finger at Izuku's chest. "There was absolutely no reason for you to put yourself in danger like that. You could have been killed, and you got in our way." "He's right," Kamui Woods added sternly. "You have no license. You rushed a volatile situation. If All Might hadn't arrived, you both would be dead." Normally Izuku would have flinched. He would have bowed his head, mumbled an apology, and let the heroes berate him. He worshipped these people. He respected their authority. But as Death Arms continued to yell, Izuku looked past him. He looked at the burning wreckage. He looked at the spot where the heroes had stood, safely behind the tape, waiting for someone else to fix the problem while Kaken was dying. A cold, hard realization settled in Izuku's chest, extinguishing the naive fanboy he had been just hours prior. They were scared, Izuku realized. They are pros with powerful quirks, and they were scared of a fluid villain. They rely so heavily on their quirks that when they encounter a situation their quirks can't easily solve, they freeze. Izuku looked up at Death Arms. His green eyes were calm, devoid of the hero worship they usually held. "He was dying," Izuku said, his voice quiet but steady. Death Arms paused, taken aback by the boy's calm demeanor. "What?" "Kaken was dying," Izuku repeated, standing up slowly. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stand tall. "You were standing there watching him choke. Someone had to move." "Listen here, you brat," Death Arms snarled, stepping forward. "Leave it," a gruff voice interrupted. Izuku turned. Bakugo had shrugged off the paramedics and was marching over, his red eyes narrowed into furious slits. The explosive teen stopped a few feet from Izuku, his fists clenched tight at his sides. Bakugo looked from Izuku to the pros, and then back to Izuku. His pride was wounded, shattered by the fact that the quirkless weakling had charged in to save him. He wanted to yell, he wanted to scream that he didn't need help, but Bakugo had felt it. When Izuku had grabbed him, when he had ripped the sludge apart. Bakugo had seen the terrifying, glowing yellow eyes and the precise, devastating strikes. That wasn't a quirkless loser throwing a tantrum. That was a predator. Deku, Bakugo growled, his voice low. I didn't ask for your help. And you didn't save me. Got it? It was a lie, and they both knew it. But underneath the anger in Bakugo's eyes, Izuku saw something else. Confusion. And a very, very small sliver of fear. I know, Kaken, Izuku said evenly. My legs just moved on their own. Bakugo scoffed, turning on his heel and marching away, yelling at the police officers to get out of his way. The pro-heroes, uncomfortable with the interaction, eventually gave up on scolding Izuku and went back to crowd control. Izuku was dismissed, told to go straight home. He picked up his yellow backpack, the weight of the ancient scroll inside feeling heavier than before. As he walked away from the flashing lights of the Tatooine shopping district, he saw All Might being swarmed by reporters a block away. The symbol of peace was laughing, striking his signature poses, assuring the public that everything was fine. Izuku watched him for a long moment. Can you be a hero without a quirk? No. I don't think you can. All Might was wrong. The pro-heroes who relied solely on their genetic gifts were wrong. As Izuku walked down the quiet, darkened streets toward his apartment, he flexed his bruised, bloodied hands. The pain was excruciating, but it was a good pain. It was the pain of a body that had surpassed its limits. He didn't need an emitter quirk to shoot explosions. He didn't need super strength to change the weather with a punch. He didn't need to be a god. He had his body. He had his terrifying ability to adapt. And he had the water stream rock smashing fist. If the heroes of this era were going to stand by and watch people die because their quirks weren't perfectly suited for the job, then Izuku would become something different. He wouldn't be a flashy hero for the cameras. He would become absolute. A master of the body. A force of nature that no villain, and no hero, could ignore. The UA High School entrance exams were exactly 10 months away. 10 months to retrieve the rest of the scrolls. 10 months to temper his frail body into a weapon capable of withstanding his violent adaptations. 10 months to master the flow of the river and the crushing weight of the rock. Izuku Midoriya looked up at the moon, his green eyes flashing yellow in the darkness. The era of the quirkless Deku was over. The training begins tomorrow. The human body is an incredibly efficient machine, but it is fundamentally designed for self-preservation. When pushed past a certain threshold, the brain sends desperate signals to stop. Lungs burn like they are inhaling fiberglass, muscles flood with lactic acid until they seize, and the skeletal structure aches as microfractures splinter across the bone. The average person stops when the pain begins. An athlete pushes through the pain until their body physically gives out. Izuku Midoriya had to go further. He had to reach the point where his body died, just a little bit, so that his quirk could bring it back stronger. The morning after the sludge villain incident, Izuku returned to the abandoned dojo in the hills. The sky was an iron-gray canopy, threatening rain, but the air inside the ruined structure was perfectly still. He pried open the hidden floorboard, the wood groaning in the silence, and retrieved the mahogany box. Sitting cross-legged on the dusty tatami mats, he carefully unrolled the remaining 2 scrolls. The first scroll, which he had scanned the day before, detailed the fundamental philosophies and defensive katas of the water stream rock smashing fist. The second scroll was a masterclass in offensive redirection, targeting vital points, and utilizing centripetal force to exponentially increase striking power. The third scroll, however, was different. It was older, the parchment brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. It detailed no katas. Instead, it was a journal of conditioning. To master the flowing fist, the vessel must be unbreakable, the jagged calligraphy read. Flesh must become iron. Bone must become steel. The mind must become a predator's, unburdened by hesitation. You must not merely mimic the river, you must survive the storm. Break the body. Let it rebuild. Break it again. A warrior of true strength is born in the crucible of their own agony. Izuku stared at the words. He thought of All Might's deflated form, the pity in his sunken blue eyes. He thought of Bakugo, suffocating in the sludge while pro-heroes stood paralyzed by their own limitations. He thought of his own terrifying power, the golden eyes, the momentary evolution that had allowed him to tear a monster apart with his bare hands. Reactive evolution. He understood now what his quirk was. It wasn't a power he could summon at will to lift heavy objects or shoot fire. It was a survival mechanism. It forced his cellular structure to rapidly adapt to lethal stress. But to harness it, to actively use it to reshape his body into the vessel the scroll demanded, he had to purposefully subject himself to that stress. Izuku stripped off his middle school jacket, folding it neatly. He wore only a white t-shirt and loose sweatpants. He walked out of the dojo, stepping into the dense, untamed forest behind it. He found an ancient oak tree, its trunk thicker than a car. The bark was rough, covered in knobby, unyielding growths. Izuku took a breath, lowering into the basic horse stance detailed in the first scroll. He clenched his right fist. Break the body. He punched the tree. Skin tore instantly. Wood splintered. A jolt of sharp, blinding pain shot up his forearm. He gasped, his eyes watering. He pulled his fist back. His knuckles were already bleeding, raw and red. Let it rebuild. He punched it again. Harder. The sickening crack of his middle knuckle fracturing echoed through the quiet woods. Izuku dropped to his knees, clutching his hand to his chest, biting his lip so hard he tasted copper to keep from screaming. His vision blurred with tears. The pain was agonizing. Every survival instinct in his brain screamed at him to go home, to bandage his hand, to give up this suicidal delusion. But then, the heat bloomed. It started at the base of his spine, just like yesterday. A rush of electric, searing heat that traveled up his spinal cord and flooded his nervous system. His breathing hitched. The emerald of his eyes briefly flashed a piercing, predatory yellow. He looked down at his hand. The bleeding was already slowing. The agonizing throb of the fractured bone shifted into a deep, intense itch. His quirk was activating, fueled by the localized trauma. It wasn't just healing the bone, it was actively calcifying it, knitting the microscopic fractures with denser layers of calcium and protein. The torn skin of his knuckles was sealing, the epidermis hardening into a fine, imperceptible callus. 10 minutes later, the pain was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow hunger, but his hand was whole. Izuku stood up. He looked at the tree, then at his fist. He threw a third punch. This time, the wood cracked inward, leaving a shallow indentation in the ancient bark. His knuckles didn't bleed. Izuku Midoriya didn't go to Dagoba Beach to clear trash. He didn't build his body by hauling scrap metal or moving refrigerators. He turned the forest into his torture chamber. For the first 3 months, he focused entirely on breaking his limits. He ran up the steepest, most treacherous mountain paths with a backpack full of river stones until his lungs bled and he coughed up crimson on the dirt. When he collapsed, gasping for air, his quirk would trigger, forcing his cardiovascular system to expand, his lung capacity to deepen. He punched rocks. He kicked iron-hard bamboo stalks until his shins fractured, waiting out the agonizing minutes of his quirk knitting the bones back together thicker, harder, denser. He stood beneath the freezing, pounding weight of a nearby mountain waterfall for hours, practicing the deep, rhythmic breathing techniques of the scroll while the icy torrent tried to crush his spine. His mother Inko grew worried. Izuku was eating 4 times his normal amount, coming home covered in dirt, bandages, and bruises, but when she looked into his eyes she saw something that terrified her and silenced her. The anxious, trembling boy was gone. In his place was a quiet, intense young man with a gaze as sharp as a scalpel. He was focused, polite, but distant, entirely consumed by a singular, burning purpose. At school, the changes became impossible to ignore. Izuku sat in the back of the class, quiet, staring out the window. But his posture had fundamentally shifted. He no longer hunched his shoulders defensively. He sat with a strange, relaxed slouch, a deceptive looseness that hid a terrifyingly coiled tension. His uniform no longer fit loosely, it stretched tight over lean, dense muscle. Bakugo noticed. How could he not? The nerd who used to flinch when Bakugo so much as popped a spark in his palm now didn't even blink when an explosion went off near his desk. One afternoon, in the 4th month of the 10-month deadline, Bakugo cornered Izuku behind the school building. What the hell is your game, Deku? Bakugo snarled, slamming his hands onto the brick wall on either side of Izuku's head, trapping him. Small explosions popped from Bakugo's palms, singing the bricks. Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He just looked up at Bakugo, his green eyes utterly calm. Game, Kaken? Izuku asked quietly. Don't play dumb with me. Bakugo roared, his pride still stinging from the sludge villain incident months ago. You think you're better than me now? You think whatever hidden quirk you used back there makes you hot shit? You're still a pebble in my path. Izuku looked at Bakugo's hands. In the past, he would have seen a terrifying threat. Now, his mind automatically calculated the angle of Bakugo's shoulders, the weight distribution on his left foot, the telltale twitch of the extensor tendons in his forearms before an explosion. If I pivot my right shoulder backward by 2 inches, the blast radius misses my face. A simultaneous sweeping strike to his hyperextended left elbow would dislocate the joint, dropping him instantly. The thought came unbidden, cold, and clinical. It was the martial arts taking root in his subconscious. Izuku blinked, pushing the violent calculation away. He didn't want to hurt Bakugo. He just didn't fear him anymore. I don't think I'm better than you, Kaken, Izuku said softly, his voice carrying a strange, resonant echo. He gently raised his hands, grasping Bakugo's wrists. Bakugo tried to jerk away, to blast him, but Izuku's grip was like an industrial vice. The sheer, unyielding density of Izuku's fingers dug into Bakugo's pulse points. With a smooth, fluid motion, Izuku applied a microscopic twist, disrupting Bakugo's balance entirely. Bakugo stumbled backward, his arms falling to his sides, his explosions fizzling out as his brain momentarily lost coordination. Izuku stepped past him, his hands sliding casually into his pockets. He slightly hunched his shoulders, walking away with a loose, rolling gait. I'm just playing a different game, Izuku called back over his shoulder. Bakugo stood frozen, staring at his wrists. They were already bruising. A cold sweat broke out on the back of the explosive teen's neck. For a brief second, when Izuku had grabbed him, Bakugo hadn't felt like he was facing a classmate. He felt like he had just stuck his hand into the jaws of a wolf. Months 5 through 8 were dedicated to the flow. With his body tempered into a hyperdense, hyperflexible weapon through repeated trauma and reactive healing, Izuku began the true practice of the water-stream rock-smashing fist. The abandoned dojo became his sanctuary. He swept the floors, repaired the sliding doors, and set up a labyrinth of hanging logs suspended by thick ropes. He would push the logs so they swung chaotically in every direction, and then he would stand in the center. The goal was not to dodge. The goal was to redirect. At first, he was battered. The heavy wooden logs slammed into his ribs, his back, the back of his head. Every impact that threatened to break him only triggered his quirk, hardening his flesh and sharpening his kinetic vision. By the 7th month, he wasn't getting hit anymore. He moved like water. His eyes glowed a faint, steady yellow as he entered a state of pure, thoughtless flow. A log would swing at his face, and his hand would rise, tracing the curvature of the wood, applying a gentle, frictionless palm strike that sent the massive log spinning away without altering his own center of gravity. He flowed between the swinging hazards, his body twisting, bending, and parrying with breathtaking grace. Breathe in. Draw the opponent's power. Breathe out. Return it 100-fold. His physical transformation was startling. His childish roundness had vanished, replaced by sharp, angular features. His green hair had grown wilder, partially obscuring his intense, predatory eyes. When he took off his shirt to train, his musculature looked almost unnatural. He wasn't bulky or massive like All Might. He was lean, every muscle fiber defined, packed tight as steel cables beneath his skin. Faint, silvery scars, the few wounds his quirk couldn't entirely erase, crisscrossed his knuckles, his shins, and his forearms. He had become a creature of absolute combat efficiency. In the final month before the UA entrance exam, Izuku took his final test. Deep in the mountainous woods, rumors had spread among hikers of a massive, rogue wild boar, a mutant animal the size of a small van, highly territorial and incredibly aggressive. Izuku hunted it. He found the beast drinking from a stream at twilight. It was monstrous, covered in bristling black hair, with tusks as thick as baseball bats. When it saw Izuku, it snorted, pawing the ground, before charging with the force of a freight train. Izuku didn't assume a stance. He stood completely relaxed, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. As the boar closed the distance, a massive tusk aimed directly to impale him. Izuku exhaled. He stepped diagonally, an inch from the razor-sharp ivory. His hands blurred. His left palm slapped the side of the boar's snout, redirecting its immense forward momentum. His right hand caught the underbelly, using the beast's own weight and speed to flip it entirely upside down. With a deafening crash, the giant boar slammed onto its back, the earth shaking beneath the impact. The wind was knocked out of the beast. It lay there, stunned, completely immobilized by a boy a tenth of its size. Izuku stood over the beast, his hands back in his pockets. His breathing hadn't even elevated. "You should move deeper into the mountains," Izuku murmured to the dazed animal. "The heroes will kill you if you wander into the city." He turned and walked away, his silhouette melting into the shadows of the forest. The 10 months of hell were over. The vessel was forged. The morning of the UA entrance exam was crisp and clear. Izuku stood before the massive glass and steel gates of UA High School. He wore his black middle school uniform, though it felt tight across his shoulders and chest. Around him, hundreds of hopeful students milled about, chatting nervously, boasting about their quirks, or staring in awe at the legendary campus. Izuku felt completely detached from them. He didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel excited. He felt a cool, icy calm settling over his mind, the same calm he felt when the logs were swinging toward his head. "Out of my way, Deku!" Izuku didn't turn around. He simply shifted his left shoulder an inch forward and pivoted his right heel. Katsuki Bakugo stormed past him, his shoulder missing Izuku's back by a fraction of a millimeter. Bakugo stopped, turning to glare at him, a scowl masking his underlying unease. Ever since that day behind the school, Bakugo had avoided physical confrontation with Izuku. It infuriated him, this primal instinct telling him not to poke the bear. "Don't stand in the middle of the path like a moron," Bakugo spat before stomping off toward the auditorium. Izuku merely exhaled a quiet breath and began to walk. As he approached the main entrance, his enhanced peripheral vision caught a sudden movement. A girl with a brown bob and permanent blush marks on her cheeks had tripped over a slightly raised paving stone. She was falling face first toward the concrete. Before her quirk could activate to catch herself, Izuku moved. To the untrained eye, he seemed to teleport. He closed the 10-foot gap in a single, fluid step. His hand shot out, grasping the back of her uniform collar. But rather than arresting her momentum abruptly, which would have given her whiplash, he pulled her slightly upward and spun on his heel, guiding her falling momentum into a graceful, rotational arc until her feet were planted firmly on the ground. He let go instantly, his hands returning to his pockets. Achiko Uraraka blinked, dizzy and incredibly confused. 1 second she was falling, the next she was standing upright, having experienced a sensation like being swept up by a gentle, invisible river. She turned to look at her savior. She expected to see someone smiling broadly. Instead, she found a boy with wild green hair, a slight slouch, and intense, piercing eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Careful," Izuku said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Your center of gravity is too far forward." Before Uraraka could thank him, or process his bizarre advice, he was already walking away, blending into the crowd. She stared after his retreating back, a shiver running down her arms. Who was that? The written exam was trivial. Izuku's mind, sharpened by years of obsessive analysis and 10 months of hyper-accelerated neural adaptation, tore through the academic questions with clinical efficiency. Then came the orientation for the practical exam. The auditory hero, Present Mike, stood at the podium, screaming into the microphone to a largely silent audience. He explained the point system, 3 types of villain bots worth 1, 2, and 3 points, respectively. Destroy the bots, rack up points. Izuku sat with his arms crossed, his eyes closed. He visualized the scenario, a massive urban arena. Hundreds of teenagers with flashy quirks. Robotic enemies. "Excuse me. I have a question." A tall, stiff-looking boy with glasses and engines in his cab stood up, pointing at the pamphlet. "There are 4 silhouettes on this handout. If this is a misprint, UA, the top hero academy in Japan, should be ashamed. And you, with the curly hair," the boy spun to point directly at Izuku. You've been slouching and keeping your eyes closed this entire time. If you aren't taking this seriously, leave at once. You are distracting the rest of us." The auditorium went dead silent. Everyone looked at Izuku. Izuku slowly opened his eyes. He didn't uncross his arms. He didn't adjust his posture. He simply looked at the boy, his gaze so heavy, so completely devoid of intimidation or apology, that the boy with glasses instinctively took a half-step back, his robotic arm gestures faltering. "I'm visualizing the urban layout based on the schematic," Izuku replied evenly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the large room without a microphone. "And the fourth robot is a zero-point obstacle." President Mike was about to explain it. "You're interrupting." President Mike blinked behind his orange shades. Right on, listener." Exactly what he said. "The fourth robot is the zero-pointer. An obstacle you should all run away from. It's a massive gimmick, capiche?" The boy with the glasses flushed red, bowing stiffly. "I apologize for my outburst." Izuku closed his eyes again, returning to his visualization. A zero-pointer. An obstacle. Pure, unadulterated brute force. How interesting. Battle Center B was a sprawling, hyper-realistic cityscape. Towering skyscrapers, wide asphalt roads, and intricate alleyways formed a labyrinth of combat zones. A massive crowd of examinees stood behind the colossal metal gates, stretching, hyping themselves up, and discussing strategies. Izuku stood at the very front, pressing almost flush against the metal doors. He had removed his school jacket, wearing a tight black t-shirt that highlighted the coiled tension in his back and shoulders. He was breathing in a specific, rhythmic pattern: inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 4. Thump. 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 His heart rate slowed. The ambient noise of the crowd faded to a dull hum. Click. The massive locks on the gates disengaged. Before the heavy doors had even opened a full foot, Izuku was gone. "Hey, where'd he go?" someone shouted. "And go!" President Mick's voice blasted over the speakers. "What are you waiting for? There are no countdowns in real battles. Run, run, run!" The crowd surged forward, pouring into the faux city. But Izuku was already 3 blocks deep. His speed wasn't born of a speed-enhancing quirk. It was pure, unadulterated biomechanical perfection. His strides were long, his center of gravity incredibly low, his footfalls completely silent. He rounded a corner, and came face to face with a group of 3 one-pointer robots. They were blocky, rolling on treads, their mechanical eyes glowing red. Target acquired, the synthesized voices droned. 2 of the robots raised their metallic arms to strike, while the third fired a volley of rubberized tracking missiles. Izuku didn't slow down. He accelerated. As the missiles approached, Izuku didn't try to dodge them. He entered the flow. His right hand blurred into a series of open palm strikes. He didn't hit the missiles head-on. He grazed them, striking their cylindrical bodies at precise, tangential angles. The microscopic application of force altered their aerodynamics entirely. The missiles spun wildly off course, curving around Izuku and slamming directly into the 2 robots preparing to punch him. The explosions shattered their optic sensors and tore off their arms. Izuku was already upon the 3rd robot. It lunged at him, swinging a massive metallic fist. Izuku stepped inside the robot's guard, his back pressing against the machine's chassis. He grabbed the swinging arm by the wrist joint. Using the robot's immense forward momentum, Izuku pivoted his hips, dropping his weight and executing a flawless shoulder throw. The water stream rock-smashing fist allowed a master to redirect the force of a raging river. A 1-ton machine was nothing. The robot flew over Izuku's shoulder with terrifying velocity, crashing headfirst into the asphalt. The impact shattered its central chassis, the machinery sparking and dying instantly. 3 points. Izuku didn't pause. He leaped off the destroyed robot, launching himself toward the side of a building. He ran 3 steps vertically up the brick wall, backflipped off the surface, and landed in the middle of a newly arrived squad of 2-pointers and 3-pointers. What followed was not a fight. It was a massacre. Izuku moved like a dancer in a tempest. He never initiated an attack. He waited for the machines to strike. When a 3-pointer fired a metallic punch, Izuku would weave around the arm, striking the elbow joint with the heel of his hand, hyperextending the metal and snapping the limb clean off. He would then use the severed arm as a blunt weapon, spinning it with incredible torque to decapitate a two-pointer behind him. He flowed beneath tank treads, his fingers digging into the unarmored underbellies to rip out vital wiring. He redirected crossfire so the robots continuously destroyed each other. His movements were accompanied by a faint, bluish-white aura, the physical manifestation of air being displaced by the sheer speed and precision of his strikes. From the rooftops, Uraraka watched in horrified awe. She had managed to use her zero-gravity quirk to drop a robot, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the green-haired boy below. He was tearing through solid steel with his bare hands. He looked less like a hero student and more like an apex predator turned loose in a metallic jungle. He was terrifying. High above the mock cities, in a darkened observation room, the faculty of UA High School sat before a massive bank of monitors. "We have a strong crop this year," Midnight purred, watching a monitor displaying Bakugo blowing up a building to crush a squad of robots. "Very aggressive." "Indeed," Snipe nodded. "Some flashy quirks. The explosive kid, the engine kid, the half-and-half boy in Center C." "But," Snipe pointed his gloved finger at a monitor in the center of the console. Every pro-hero in the room had their eyes glued to it. On the screen, Izuku Midoriya was dismantling a three-pointer by gracefully sidestepping a heavy laser blast, grabbing the robot's cannon, and twisting it so violently the chassis torqued and snapped its own spine. "What in the world is his quirk?" Ectoplasm asked, leaning forward, his hidden eyes fixed on the screen. "Super strength? Enhanced speed? Kinetic absorption?" "None of the above," a tired, gruff voice replied. Shota Aizawa, the erasure hero, stood in the back of the room, wrapped in his yellow sleeping bag. His bloodshot eyes were wide, fixated on Izuku's fluid movements. "Look at the data sheet," Aizawa continued. Izuku Midoriya. Quirk listed, reactive evolution. Triggers only under lethal stress to adapt the body. What he is doing right now, he isn't using a quirk. "Impossible," Vlad King scoffed. "He just ripped the treads off a tank." "He's not overpowering them," Aizawa analyzed, his voice low and intensely serious. "He's using their own weight and momentum against them. He targets structural weak points, joints, and servos. He deflects force at tangential angles. It's pure martial arts." "Martial arts?" Midnight repeated, incredulous. "You can't punch through steel with martial arts." "He's not punching through it. He's breaking it from the inside out using shockwaves generated by hyper-focused strikes," a high-pitched, cheerful voice chimed in. Principal Nizu, the animal-like genius, sat sipping tea from a delicate china cup. His black, beady eyes were completely locked onto Izuku. "Fascinating," Nizu murmured. "A fighting style designed to deflect the heaviest blows and return them with lethal efficiency. It is beautiful, yet incredibly savage. He fights with the ruthlessness of a villain." "He's too brutal," Snipe agreed, looking slightly unnerved. "He's dismantling them like he enjoys it." All Might, sitting in his skeletal form in the corner, felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Young Midoriya, you were quirkless 10 months ago. What have you done to yourself?" Nizu placed his teacup down. A small, chilling smile spread across his furry face. "Let us see," Nizu said softly, his paw hovering over a large red button on his console, "how the master of the flow deals with an immovable object." Nizu pressed the button. The ground shook. Izuku paused, standing amidst a graveyard of sparking, smoking machinery. He didn't even know his score. It didn't matter. He was simply breathing, his body humming with perfectly utilized kinetic energy. The earthquake intensified. The asphalt cracked and buckled beneath his feet. Glass shattered from the nearby windows. A shadow fell over the street. Izuku looked up. Tearing through the cityscape, easily dwarfing the tallest buildings, was the zero-pointer. It was a mechanical titan, a localized disaster on treads. Its massive fist alone was the size of a house. Less than 2 minutes remaining. President Mike announced. Panic erupted. The examinees, who had been confidently blasting robots moments prior, broke entirely. They turned and ran, screaming in terror, as the zero-pointer began to crush buildings beneath its advance. Izuku stood his ground. He looked at the titan. An obstacle, he thought. A test of fear. He had no intention of fighting it. There were no points, and there was no strategic value in engaging a target of that size. He turned to leave, his body still completely relaxed. "Oh! Help! Please!" Izuku froze. He whipped his head around. Through the dust and falling debris, he saw her. The girl with the brown hair, the one he had caught from falling. She was trapped, her leg pinned under a massive slab of concrete that had been dislodged by the robot's treads. She was trying to push it off, tears streaming down her face, but she was trapped. And the zero-pointer was raising its colossal foot, preparing to crush her and the entire street. The other examinees were running away. The boy with the engines ran past, his face pale with terror. No one was stopping. "They're scared again," Izuku thought, the cold, clinical rage from the sludge incident flaring back to life. Heroes, running from a machine. Izuku didn't think. He didn't plan. He exhaled a long, slow breath, expelling every ounce of hesitation from his lungs. When he inhaled, his eyes snapped open. The emerald irises were entirely gone, replaced by a blinding, predatory gold. The faint, bluish-white aura around his hands violently shifted, erupting into a roaring, jagged blue light. His quirk didn't just activate, it exploded. The sheer psychological terror of the impending crushing weight, combined with his desperate need to save the girl, pushed his reactive evolution into overdrive. His muscle fibers tightened, his bones hardened to the density of titanium, and his heart pumped blood at a terrifying, supersonic rate. The ground beneath his feet shattered like glass as he launched himself forward. He was a blur of motion. He didn't run along the ground. He ran up the falling debris. He leaped onto a chunk of falling masonry, using it as a springboard to launch himself higher. He bounced between the collapsing walls of a building, scaling the destruction like a demon ascending from hell. Uraraka watched him through blurry eyes. She saw the boy who had caught her, now enveloped in a terrifying aura, flying toward the metallic titan. Izuku reached the apex of his jump, soaring directly toward the center of the zero-pointer's massive facial plating, right between its glowing red optics. "Break the body." Izuku drew his right arm back. He didn't form a fist. He held his hand flat, his fingers extended and tightly grouped, forming a spear point. All of the kinetic energy of his ascent, all the rotational torque of his hips, and the hyperdense, evolutionary power of his muscles were channeled into the tips of his fingers. He recalled the words of the second scroll. The ultimate offensive application of the water stream rock's smashing fist. Let it rebuild. Izuku struck. It wasn't a loud, booming impact like All Might's punches. It was a sharp, piercing crack. Izuku's spear hand struck the reinforced steel plating of the zero-pointer. The localized pressure was so unfathomably intense that the steel didn't bend. It instantly shattered. But Izuku didn't stop there. He pushed his arm forward, vibrating his hand at a terrifying frequency. He sent a concentrated shockwave directly through the breach, bypassing the armor and violently striking the internal mechanisms. The water stream rock's smashing fist rippled through the machine. Time seemed to stop. Then, the zero-pointer's eyes flickered and died. A deafening, metallic groan echoed across the entire arena. Starting from the point of impact, massive shockwaves ripped through the robot's chassis. The reinforced armor plating buckled outwards. The central processor, the hydraulic lines, the power cores, everything inside the machine was violently, completely pulverized by the penetrating martial force. With a thunderous explosion that sent shockwaves powerful enough to knock the fleeing students off their feet, the massive head of the zero-pointer blew apart from the inside out. The colossal machine slumped backward, effectively dead before it hit the ground, crashing into the foe's city and sending a massive cloud of dust into the stratosphere. In the observation room, there was no sound. The teacup shattered on the floor by Nisa's feet. Aizawa had dropped his sleeping bag. All Might was gripping the console so hard the metal was bending. On the screen, as the dust cleared, they saw Izuku Midoriya. He was falling through the air. His right arm, the one he had used to deliver the strike, hung limply at his side, the sleeve completely shredded, the skin bruised purple from the sheer kickback of the force. But as he fell, his eyes glowed gold. The deep, purple bruises were already fading. The micro tears in his muscles were already knitting themselves tighter. His quirk was healing him before he even hit the ground. Izuku spun midair, landing gracefully on a piece of rubble beside Uraraka. The golden glow faded from his eyes. He exhaled a long breath, a plume of steam rising from his lips. He looked down at the trapped girl. With his uninjured left hand, he gripped the edge of the massive concrete slab pinning her leg. Using the leverage techniques of his martial art, he shifted his weight and effortlessly tossed the boulder aside. Uraraka stared at him, trembling, unable to comprehend the level of violence and grace she had just witnessed. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked, his voice returning to that quiet, slightly resonant tone. "Time's up." President Mick's voice blared over the speakers, snapping the tension in the arena. Izuku didn't celebrate. He didn't look at the defeated Titan. He simply offered his uninjured left hand to Uraraka, gently helping her to her feet. In the observation room, Principal Nisa stared at the screen, a genuine, unadulterated shiver running down his spine. He had wanted to test the boy's limits. He had wanted to see if the brutal, villainous fighting style held the heart of a hero. He had his answer. "Shota," Nisa said softly, not taking his eyes off Izuku Midoriya. "When the semester begins, I want you to keep a very close eye on him." "Because he's dangerous?" Aizawa asked, his voice tight. "No," Nisa replied, his eyes reflecting the image of the ruined Titan. "Because if society ever pushes that boy away again, if we ever allow him to become our enemy." Nisa paused, the silence in the room deafening. "He will kill us all." The acceptance letter had arrived in the form of a small, metallic disc that projected a high-definition hologram of All Might. Izuku had sat in his darkened bedroom, watching the symbol of peace bellow his congratulations. The pro-hero had explained the hidden metric of the practical exam, rescue points. But for Izuku, the rescue points had merely been a formality. According to the holographic scoreboard that hovered in the air, he had acquired 60 rescue points for saving Ochiko Uraraka from the zero-pointer. However, beneath that number was a much more staggering statistic, 84 villain points. He had completely shattered UA's all-time entrance exam record, previously held by All Might himself. The sheer volume of mechanical carnage he had inflicted upon the mock city had been so absolute, so overwhelmingly efficient, that the judges had awarded him first place by a margin that left the second-place examinee, Katsuki Bakugo, with 77 points, in the dust. His mother, Inko, had wept so hard she nearly dehydrated herself, clutching Izuku tightly and apologizing for ever doubting him. Izuku had simply held her, patting her back, his eyes fixed on the frozen hologram of All Might. The pro-hero's words from the rooftop felt like a lifetime ago. "Can you be a hero without a quirk?" No. Izuku had proved him wrong. He had not used an emitter power. He had not used a transformation. He had used the hardened shell of his own body and the ancient, terrifying martial art of the water stream rock-smashing fist. Now, standing before the massive, towering door of Class 1A, Izuku felt the weight of that reality settling over his shoulders. The door was comically large, clearly designed to accommodate students with extreme mutation quirks. Izuku reached out, his hand wrapping around the thick metal handle. The skin of his palm was rough, like tanned leather, callous from thousands of hours of striking bark, stone, and steel. He slid the door open. The noise of the classroom hit him instantly. "Take your feet off that desk at once!" A loud, booming voice commanded. Izuku recognized the tall, stiff boy with the glasses and engines in his calves. Tenya Ida. He was currently standing over Katsuki Bakugo, chopping the air with mechanical rigidity. "Huh!" Bakugo sneered, leaning back in his chair, his feet firmly planted on the pristine UA desk. "Who the hell are you, Four Eyes?" "I am Tenya Ida, from Semi-Private Academy." It is the height of disrespect to the upperclassmen who sat at these desks before us, and to the craftsmen who made them, to treat school property with such blatant disregard. "Semi? So you're a stuck-up elite, huh?" Bakugo grinned maliciously, small sparks popping from his cuticles. "I'm gonna have fun crushing you," Ida gasped, taking a step back. "Crushing me? Are you truly aiming to be a hero with an attitude like that?" Izuku stepped into the room, the heavy door sliding shut behind him with a soft click. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. Ida turned, his eyes widening behind his rectangular spectacles. He recognized the wild, messy green hair and the intense, piercing gaze. It was the boy from the auditorium, the one who had verbally shut him down with an aura so heavy it had made Ida choke on his own words. And more importantly, it was the boy who had leaped into the stratosphere to obliterate a mechanical titan with his bare hands. Ida immediately abandoned Bakugo and marched straight toward Izuku. "You!" Ida announced, his voice ringing through the suddenly quiet classroom. Several other students turned to look. "I must apologize to you. I misjudged you entirely during the orientation. You deduced the hidden nature of the practical exam, while I was blinded by the rules. Furthermore, your display of sheer power and heroism against the zero-pointer was staggering. I concede that you are the superior candidate." Ida finished with a stiff, perfectly 90-degree bow. "I didn't deduce anything," Izuku replied calmly, his voice a low, steady baritone that seemed to carry an unnatural resonance. He didn't bow back, nor did he look intimidated. He stood with a loose, deceptively relaxed posture, his hands resting in his pockets. "I just didn't see the point in running away from a machine." Across the room, Bakugo's chair hit the floor with a sharp clack. Bakugo stared at the doorway, his crimson eyes shrinking to pinpricks. The sneer fell from his face, replaced by a sudden, violent contortion of sheer disbelief and rising fury. Deku. What was he doing here? In the hero course? In Class 1A? Bakugo's mind raced. He remembered the entrance exam scores posted online. He had seen the name Izuku Midoriya sitting at the number 1 spot with 154 total points. Bakugo had destroyed his bedroom in a rage, convincing himself there must have been a glitch in the system. The nerd he had bullied for a decade, the quirkless Pebble, had somehow rigged the exam. That had to be it. Deku. Bakugo growled, his voice a low, venomous rumble. He began to stand up, his palms smoking. "Oh! It's you! The plain-looking boy with the super scary punch!" A cheerful voice interrupted the rising tension. Achiko Uraraka pushed past Izuku, beaming brightly. She looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "I've been looking for you. I went to present Mike to try and give you some of my points because you saved me, but he said you didn't need them. You got first place. That was so amazing, the way you jumped up and bam! You smashed it into a million pieces." Uraraka mimed a punching motion, though it lacked any of the terrifying biomechanical perfection Izuku possessed. "It wasn't a punch," Izuku corrected gently, his eyes softening a fraction as he looked at her. "It was a spearhand strike focused on structural destabilization." Uraraka blinked, tilting her head. "Oh, what now? If you're just here to make friends, you can pack up your things and leave." The voice was muffled, exhausted, and seemed to come from the floor. The entire class froze. They looked down to see a giant, yellow sleeping bag lying in the doorway behind Izuku. It unzipped, revealing a haggard man with long, unkempt black hair, dark stubble, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a decade. "It took you lot 8 seconds to quiet down," the man said, stepping out of the sleeping bag and pulling a juice pouch from his pocket. "Time is a limited resource. You kids lack rationality." He stood at the front of the classroom, his gaze sweeping over the 20 students. "I'm Shota Aizawa. Your homeroom teacher." Gasps rippled through the room. "A pro hero is our homeroom teacher?" Aizawa reached into his sleeping bag and pulled out a blue, white, and red gym uniform. He tossed it onto the front desk. "Put these on and head out to the P grounds." Now, the boys' locker room was a symphony of clanking metal lockers and nervous chatter. The teens were excited, peeling off their middle school uniforms to don the UA athletic gear. "Man, Aizawa-sensei looks totally wiped out, doesn't he?" Denki Kaminari, a boy with blonde hair and a black lightning bolt streak, remarked as he pulled off his shirt. "I wonder what kind of hero he is. Whoever he is, he commands respect," Ida declared, rigidly folding his pants. In the corner of the room, separated slightly from the rest of the group, Izuku unbuttoned his black uniform jacket. He didn't engage in the chatter. His mind was already transitioning into the cold, analytical state required for physical exertion. He let his jacket fall onto the bench, followed by his undershirt. The chatter in the locker room abruptly died. Eijiro Kirishima, a boy with spiky red hair who had been mid-laugh, stopped with his mouth hanging open. Kaminari dropped his gym shirt. Even the usually stoic Shoto Todoroki, who had been quietly changing on the other side of the room, paused to stare. Izuku Midoriya did not have the body of a 15-year-old high school student. He looked as though he had been carved from marble, and then repeatedly subjected to a crucible of extreme violence. His musculature was terrifyingly dense, lean, entirely devoid of excess body fat, with every muscle fiber defined like coiled steel cords pressing against his skin. His latissimus dorsi flared out, tapering down to a narrow waist, giving his torso a predatory V-shape. But it wasn't just the sheer density of his muscles that silenced the room. It was the scars. Faint, silvery lines of calcified tissue crisscrossed his shoulders, his ribcage, and the entirety of his arms. They weren't surgical scars. They were the healed remnants of violently torn muscle, fractured bone pushing against the dermis, and skin split by relentless impact. The most prominent scars were wrapped around his knuckles and forearms, where the bone had broken and rehealed so many times under the influence of his reactive evolution that his hands looked like lethal weapons. Izuku didn't seem to notice the stares. He calmly pulled the Yue gym shirt over his head, hiding the terrifying canvas of his torso, though the shirt clung tightly to his broad shoulders and arms. Minoru Mineta, a short boy with purple spheres for hair, swallowed hard. "Dude, what the hell have you been fighting?" he whispered. Izuku glanced over his shoulder, his green eyes utterly placid. "Trees," he replied simply. He grabbed his track pants and walked out of the locker room, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Bakugo, standing by his own locker, ground his teeth together so hard he tasted blood. Trees? What kind of sick joke is he playing? The pea grounds were vast, stretching out under a clear, bright morning sky. The 20 students of Class 1A stood in a loose cluster, watching Aizawa as he held up a digital tablet. "A quirk apprehension test?" Uraraka asked, her eyes wide. "But what about the entrance ceremony? The orientation? If you want to make the big leagues, you can't waste time on pointless ceremonies," Aizawa said dryly, his tired eyes scanning the students. "Here at UA, we aren't tethered to traditions. That means I get to run my class however I see fit." He held up the tablet. "You've been doing these tests since junior high. Pitches, long jumps, 50-meter dashes. But you always did them without quirks. The country still uses an unstandardized system of averages. It's irrational. The Ministry of Education is procrastinating." Aizawa turned his gaze to the side. "Bakugo. You finished second in the practical exam." Bakugo flinched, the word second hitting him like a physical blow. He glared fiercely at the back of Izuku's head. "In junior high, what was your best result for the softball throw?" Aizawa asked. 67 meters, Bakugo muttered. "Try doing it with your quirk." Aizawa tossed a baseball to Bakugo. "Step inside the circle. You can do whatever you want, as long as you don't leave the ring. Give it everything you've got." Bakugo stepped into the white chalk circle. He stretched his arms, a feral grin slowly returning to his face. "I'll show them. I'll show that damn nerd the difference between us." He wound his arm back, his sweat glands instantly producing nitroglycerin-like sweat. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into the pitch. "Die!" Bakugo roared. A massive explosion detonated from his palm the exact moment the ball left his fingertips. The sheer concussive force sent a shockwave across the field, ruffling the students' uniforms. The ball rocketed into the sky, leaving a trail of black smoke. "Know your own maximum first," Aizawa said, looking down at his tablet as it beeped. He turned the screen to face the class. "That is the most rational way to form the foundation of a hero." The screen read, 705.2 meters. The class erupted. "Whoa! Over 700 meters? That looks like so much fun. We can use our quirks as much as we want. This is awesome." Aizawa's eyes narrowed. The bags under his eyes seemed to darken. "Fun, you say?" The temperature on the field seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Aizawa's slouched posture straightened, and an aura of lethal intent bled from him. "You have 3 years to become heroes. You think it's going to be games and playtime the whole way through? Fine. Let's make it interesting." Aizawa smiled, a chilling, feral expression. "Whoever comes in last place across all 8 events will be judged as having no potential, and will be expelled immediately. Expelled? Uraraka gasped. But it's the first day. Even if it wasn't, that's completely unfair. Natural disasters, Aizawa replied coldly. Mass highway collisions. Rampaging villains. Calamities that cannot be predicted. Japan is covered with unfairness. Heroes are the ones who reverse those situations. If you wanted to talk to your friends at McDonald's after school, too bad. For the next 3 years, Yui is going to inflict hardship after hardship upon you. Go beyond. Plus ultra. Overcome it with all you've got. Izuku stood in the back of the crowd, his face completely expressionless. Unfair, he thought. The word was a familiar flavor on his tongue. He knew unfairness intimately. He knew the unfairness of a doctor's diagnosis, the unfairness of an idol's pity, and the unfairness of a friend's cruelty. Aizawa was right. The world was fundamentally unequal. The only way to survive it was to become stronger than the unfairness itself. Izuku's breathing deepened. Inhale for 4. Hold for 2. Exhale for 4. His heart rate steadied into the rhythmic cadence of the water stream rock's smashing fist. Demonstration is over, Aizawa said, lowering his tablet. The real thing starts now. Test 1, 50-meter dash. Runners, on your marks, the robotic voice of the camera drone announced. Izuku stepped up to the starting line. Beside him was Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo was already crouched low, both hands positioned behind him, ready to fire off explosions to propel himself forward. He glared sideways at Izuku. I don't know what kind of trick you pulled at the exam, Deku, Bakugo hissed. But you're out of your depth. I'm going to bury you. Izuku didn't look at him. He stood perfectly upright, seemingly relaxed. He didn't drop into a sprinter's crouch. Instead, he shifted his feet slightly, adopting a variation of the water stream martial stance. His knees bent marginally, his spine aligned perfectly with his center of gravity. He didn't need to trigger his reactive evolution. The sheer baseline density of his fast-twitch muscle fibers, built through 10 months of localized trauma and hyperhealing, was beyond human limits. He visualized the kinetic chain, the energy traveling from the earth, up through the arches of his feet, through the calcified bones of his shins, into the explosive power of his thighs and hips. Readied. The drone beeped. Get ready to eat my dust, you quirkless loser, Bakugo thought, sparking his palms. Go! Boom! Bakugo fired a dual blast from his hands, launching himself forward over the track like a human missile. He grinned, feeling the wind tear past his face. But then, a localized gust of wind, sharp and violent, hit Bakugo from the side. He blinked. He was alone on the track. He whipped his head forward. Crossing the finish line, 20 meters ahead of him, was a blur of green hair. Izuku hadn't run, he had bounded. Utilizing the fluid, explosive footwork of the flowing fist, every step he took dug into the synthetic rubber of the track, propelling him forward with the coiled force of a spring. He crossed the 50-meter mark in exactly 3.01 seconds. He slowed to a halt gracefully, turning around just in time to watch Bakugo cross the line. 4.13 seconds, the drone announced for Bakugo. Bakugo skidded to a halt, his jaw hanging open. He stared at the timer, then at Izuku. Izuku wasn't even panting. He looked like he had just taken a leisurely stroll. From the sidelines, Aizawa watched through half-lidded eyes. He tapped his tablet. No quirk activation detected. Pure biomechanical output. The sheer tensile strength of his leg muscles is absurd. Test 2, grip strength. The class moved to the gym. The students were handed digital dynamometers. Izuku took his, holding the cold metal grip in his scarred right hand. He recalled the sensation of his knuckles breaking against the oak tree, the way the bone had shattered, the agonizing heat of his quirk knitting it back together thicker, denser, heavily calcified. His bones were no longer standard human calcium. They were closer to reinforced steel. He casually squeezed the device. He didn't even use the full rotational torque of his wrist. He just applied a standard crushing grip. Crack. The digital screen didn't display a number. It instantly shattered, the liquid crystal leaking out. The thick metal springs inside the dynamometer snapped with a sharp ping, and the plastic casing crushed inward like aluminum foil under a hydraulic press. Izuku stopped, looking down at the ruined machine. Pieces of plastic fell from his palm. Oops, Izuku murmured. Next to him, Mineta let out a high-pitched squeak, looking at his own score of 42 kilograms, and slowly backed away from Izuku. Aizawa, standing a few feet away, marked a note on his tablet. Grip strength, unmeasurable. Machine destroyed. Test 3, standing long jump. Izuku stood at the edge of the sandbox. He bent his knees, entering the flow state. He channeled his breath, bringing oxygen into every hyperdense muscle cell. When he jumped, he didn't leap. He cleared the entire sandbox, soaring through the air in a parabolic arc that carried him over the heads of the students waiting on the other side. He landed softly on his feet, his knees bending to flawlessly absorb the kinetic impact. He's like a frog. A Suyusui, a girl with frog-like features, croaked in awe. No, he's faster. Test 4, repeated sidesteps. Mineta was showing off, using his sticky hairballs to bounce rapidly back and forth between the lines. Then it was Izuku's turn. Aizawa watched closely. This was a test of pure agility and coordination. Izuku positioned himself between the lines. He lowered his center of gravity significantly. Water stream rocks smashing fist, flowing water step. Izuku moved. He didn't just sidestep, his body blurred. To the naked eyes of the students, it looked as though there were 3 Izuku Midoriyas occupying the space simultaneously. The afterimages were created by his terrifying velocity, and the instantaneous shift of his weight from one foot to the other without losing a fraction of kinetic energy. The air around him whipped into a small vortex, kicking up dust from the gymnasium floor. Is that a speed quirk? Kaminari yelled over the wind. No, Ida said, his eyes glued to Izuku's feet, completely mesmerized. Look at his footwork. There's no wasted movement. His center of gravity never shifts vertically. It's absolute, perfect biomechanical efficiency. He's fighting the air. Test 5, the softball pitch. The class returned to the outdoor field. The sun was climbing higher, casting sharp shadows across the dirt. The morale of the class was shifting. The initial excitement had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating apprehension. Uraraka had just scored an infinity by removing the gravitational pull on her softball, but everyone's eyes were drawn to the boy walking toward the chalk circle. Izuku Midoriya had dominated every single physical test without seemingly breaking a sweat, and more terrifyingly, without any visible flash of a quirk. No fire, no engines, no glowing energy, just cold, absolute physical supremacy. Izuku stepped into the circle. He held the small, white softball in his hand, feeling the raised red stitches against his calluses. From the sidelines, Aizawa's eyes narrowed. His capture weapon, the carbon fiber cloth wrapped around his neck, loosened slightly. Aizawa had read Izuku's file meticulously. Quirk, reactive evolution. Triggers passively under lethal stress, accelerating cellular regeneration and adaptation. It was a dangerous quirk. A quirk that couldn't be trained in a traditional sense without risking the user's life. Aizawa had fully intended to erase Midoriya's quirk if he saw the boy attempting to push his body into a state of lethal stress just to throw a ball. But as Aizawa stared at Izuku through the gaps in his hair, he activated his erasure anyway. His eyes flashed red, his hair floating upward. He looked at Izuku, searching for the telltale spark of quirk activation. There was nothing. Izuku felt a strange sensation wash over him, a slight tingling on his skin, like a drop in static electricity. He glanced sideways, noting Aizawa's glowing red eyes and floating hair. Erasure, Izuku noted analytically. He's erasing my quirk. Izuku almost smiled. It didn't matter. His quirk wasn't active. What Aizawa was looking at wasn't a superpower. It was the permanent result of 10 months of torture. The muscles, the bone density, the scarred ligaments, they were a part of his baseline biology now. Erasure couldn't erase a callus, and it couldn't erase a martial art. Izuku turned his attention back to the field. If I use purely muscular strength, I'll likely tear the rotator cuff, Izuku calculated. A standard throw is inefficient. I need to use the entire kinetic chain. Rotational force. Izuku stood sideways in the circle. He widened his stance, dropping his hips into a deep martial arts posture. He held the ball in his right hand, extending his left arm forward, his fingers loose and relaxed. He closed his eyes. Breathe in. Draw the power. His left foot stomped the earth. The sound was like a cannon shot. The ground beneath his foot cracked, spiderwebs of pulverized dirt spreading outward. Breathe out. Return it 100-fold. Izuku didn't throw the ball with his arm. He initiated the movement from his left heel. The kinetic force traveled up his leg, into his hips. He snapped his waist with terrifying velocity, his torso torquing violently. His spine acted as a whip, channeling the rotational momentum up through his latissimus dorsi, across his heavily scarred shoulders, and finally down his right arm. His arm whipped forward, breaking the sound barrier. Crack! A deafening sonic boom echoed across the field, sending a visible shockwave of displaced air outward. The chalk of the circle was blown away in a massive cloud of white dust. Aizawa's hair whipped wildly around his face from the wind pressure. The softball vanished. There was no arc. There was no visible trajectory. It was simply gone, leaving a faint contrail of distorted air in its wake. The silence on the field was absolute. Aizawa stared at his tablet. The digital numbers were climbing so fast they blurred, before finally settling with a sharp beep. Aizawa slowly turned the screen to the class. 1,524.3 meters. The students were paralyzed. 1,500 meters. Kaminari whispered, his brain failing to process the number. Without a kinetic enhancement quirk, Ida breathed, removing his glasses to clean them, as if his eyes were deceiving him. He generated a sonic boom with sheer rotational torque. Inside the circle, Izuku stood upright, exhaling a long, slow breath. The muscles in his right arm twitched slightly, a dull ache settling into his shoulder joint, but it was well within manageable limits. He turned to walk out of the circle. Hey! The word cut through the silence like a jagged piece of glass. Izuku stopped. He looked to the side. Katsuki Bakugo was standing at the front of the student cluster. His head was bowed, his blonde bangs shadowing his eyes. His entire body was vibrating. Small, violent pops of nitroglycerin exploded from his palms, dripping onto the grass and singeing the earth. Bakugo's mind had snapped. The 50-meter dash. The grip strength. The jump. And now this. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a glitch in the exam grading. The quirkless loser, the pebble he had kicked around for 10 years, the boy he had told to take a swan dive off the roof, was standing in front of him with power that rivaled pro heroes. It invalidated Bakugo's entire existence. It shattered his worldview. If Deku was this strong, then what was Bakugo? Was he the weakling? Was he the pebble? DKU, Bakugo erupted. He didn't care about Aizawa. He didn't care about the test. Blind, unadulterated rage consumed him. He launched himself forward with a massive explosion from both hands, hurtling toward Izuku at point-blank range. Hey, stop! Kirishima yelled, reaching out. Bakugo, stand down! Aizawa barked, his capture weapon unfurling. But Bakugo was too fast. He crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, his right hand drawn back, crackling with a lethal, concentrated explosion aimed directly at the side of Izuku's head. Tell me how you did it, you bastard! Bakugo roared, thrusting his palm forward. Time slowed down to an absolute crawl for Izuku Midoriya. He didn't panic. He didn't feel fear. The reactive evolution didn't trigger, because Izuku's subconscious did not perceive Katsuki Bakugo as a lethal threat. He merely perceived him as an aggressive, predictable attack vector. Izuku's emerald eyes tracked the trajectory of Bakugo's palm. He saw the subtle twitch of the flexor muscles indicating the detonation. He saw the slight overextension of Bakugo's right shoulder, a flaw caused by blind rage. Water stream rock smashing fist. Izuku didn't dodge. He pivoted on his left heel, stepping smoothly into Bakugo's guard. As Bakugo's explosive palm came forward, Izuku's left hand rose. He didn't block the strike. He met the back of Bakugo's wrist with an open palm. Applying a frictionless, tangential pressure, Izuku guided Bakugo's arm upward in a fluid, circular motion. Redirect. The explosion detonated, but because Izuku had shifted the trajectory of the arm, the massive blast of fire and concussive force shot harmlessly into the sky, completely missing Izuku's face. Bakugo's eyes widened in sheer shock. His momentum carried him forward off balance, his arm raised helplessly above his head. Izuku didn't pause. Utilizing the rotational energy he had just stolen from Bakugo's charge, Izuku dropped low. His right leg swept out in a blindingly fast arc, striking the back of Bakugo's knees with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a sledgehammer. Sweep! Bakugo's legs were violently knocked out from under him. He was completely horizontal in the air, his brain unable to comprehend how he had gone from an explosive charge to weightlessness in less than a quarter of a second. As Bakugo began to fall, Izuku's right hand shot out, grabbing the front of Bakugo's gym shirt. Izuku didn't slam him into the ground. He gently, almost casually, redirected Bakugo's falling momentum, placing him flat on his back in the dirt. The entire sequence, from Bakugo's charge to him lying completely neutralized on the ground, took less than 0.8 seconds. Bakugo stared up at the blue sky, the breath knocked out of his lungs. He couldn't move. A dull, throbbing pain radiated from his wrist and the back of his knees. He had been dismantled. Not overpowered, not blasted away. He had been effortlessly, humiliatingly dismantled. Izuku stood over him, looking down. There was no anger in his green eyes. There was no arrogance. There was only a chilling, clinical calm. Your swing is too wide, Kaken, Izuku said softly, his voice meant only for Bakugo. And you lead with your right shoulder. It throws off your center of gravity. Bakugo gritted his teeth, tears of sheer, agonizing frustration pricking the corners of his eyes. He opened his mouth to scream, to blast Izuku point blank. Swish! A gray cloth wrapped violently around Bakugo's torso, pinning his arms to his sides. Aizawa stood a few feet away, his eyes glowing red, holding the end of his capture weapon. What did I say? Aizawa demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Are you trying to get expelled on the first day, Bakugo? Let me go! Bakugo thrashed against the bindings, but without his quirk, he was powerless. He's hiding something. He's mocking me. The only one making a mockery of themselves is you, Aizawa said coldly. He released his erasure, the glow fading from his eyes, though he kept Bakugo restrained. Aizawa looked past the struggling blonde, locking eyes with Izuku. Aizawa had seen pro heroes who couldn't have executed a parry that flawlessly. The kid hadn't used an ounce of excess energy. He had read the telegraph, redirected a lethal explosion without taking a burn, and neutralized a hostile target without inflicting permanent injury. He's not just strong, Aizawa realized, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. He's a master. A quirkless martial artist who fights like a seasoned killer. Midoriya, Aizawa said sharply. Yes, sensei? Izuku replied, turning his calm gaze to the teacher. Step away from him. The test isn't over. Izuku nodded. He turned his back on Bakugo, completely unconcerned by the murderous glare boring into his spine, and walked back to the group of students. As he approached, Class 1A subconsciously parted, creating a wide berth around him. Mineta was hiding behind tall, multi-armed shoji. Kaminari looked terrified. Even Todoroki was staring at Izuku with a mix of intense curiosity and guarded wariness. They had just watched a boy neutralize the most violently aggressive student in the class with a wave of his hand. Uraraka, however, didn't step back. She looked at Izuku, her brow furrowed in concern. Are you okay, Midoriya? You didn't get burned? Izuku looked at his hands, then at her. He offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach his intense eyes. I'm fine, Uraraka. Thank you. Aizawa watched the interaction, reeling in his capture weapon and allowing Bakugo to scramble to his feet. Bakugo didn't look at anyone. He stared at the dirt, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white, his entire worldview fractured beyond repair. Aizawa pulled out his tablet to finalize the scores. Principal Nizu was right, Aizawa thought, pulling up Izuku's profile on the screen. This kid doesn't fight like a hero. He fights like an absolute deterrent. He inspires fear before he inspires hope. Alright, that's enough, Aizawa announced, projecting the final rankings onto a hologram from his tablet. I'm not going to read out your individual scores. Look at the board. The class rushed forward to look. At the very top of the list, in bright, undeniable letters, 1. Izuku Midoriya. A few spots down, sitting at number 3, Katsuki Bakugo. And at the very bottom, 20. Minoru Mineta. Mineta fell to his knees, openly weeping and clawing at his purple hair. No! I didn't even get to touch the girls' uniforms. I'm expelled, Aizawa sighed, turning off the hologram. By the way, I was lying about the expulsion. It was a rational deception to draw out the upper limits of your quirks. The class froze, before erupting into a collective shout of relief and outrage. Of course it was a lie! A tall girl with a black ponytail, Momo Yayorozu, sighed, placing a hand on her cheek. If you thought about it logically, it was obvious. I totally thought I was a goner, Kaminari laughed nervously. Izuku simply nodded to himself. It made sense. An educator wouldn't discard potential assets so quickly. We're done here, Aizawa said, turning to walk back into the school. There are handouts with the syllabus in the classroom. When you get back, look them over. As the class began to trudge back toward the locker rooms, exhausted but relieved, Aizawa paused. He looked back over his shoulder at the green-haired boy walking quietly at the rear of the group. Izuku Midoriya, Aizawa thought. You have the power to dismantle a villain in seconds. You have the discipline of a monk. But what happens when the river stops flowing? What happens when something pushes you to your lethal limit, and that evolution of yours awakens? Aizawa turned away, pulling his sleeping bag out of his pocket. I pray to God we never have to find out.